Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to talk about using proactive messaging when calling Power Automate RPA processes from Power Virtual Agents. Let's go. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about why this episode is important. So this is a bit of a continuation from last week's video where I talk about the proactive PVA chat notifications from Power Automate. So if you haven't seen that, do go ahead and check that out. I'll include the link in the description as well. But really what we want to do is sort of extend sort of the conversation or the narrative about this feature and show how this is also applicable from an RPA perspective. And so why this is of important is that RPA processes typically are long running. They typically could take several minutes or even hours to go ahead and complete. And naturally, when we talk about PVA chatbot sessions, whenever you call a Power Automate flow, a cloud flow, there's a 2-minute timeout. And for good reason, right? Like when you have a long running process, you can lock up the client and makes it unusable, right? So much like a web page, if you had to load a web page and it took 2 hours to load, you're probably not going to hang out for the 2 hours waiting to see if this thing loads. So what we're going to do is introduce a pattern that we can leverage using this new feature in order to send updates back to our Power Virtual Agents chat client so that we can give those updates and meanwhile unblock the client so it's free to go engage in other topics as well. Now, in addition, I do want to talk about RPA because, a lot of other vendors, they do combine their chat bots with their RPA bots as kind of a cohesive offering or a composite offering. And, with PVA and Power Automate, like we can do the same thing. So there's things that you should be thinking about if you're doing RPA and you want chatbot functionality, such as like having some sort of a control center where maybe you can go ahead and list off a sort of a menu of RPA bots that you want to go ahead and kick off manually. You could use this from an error notifications perspective. Maybe you have a process that's monitoring an error log, and whenever there's an error log, you can go ahead and push a message to the owner of that specific bot. And then, perform some level of remediation. Maybe it's kicking it off again. Maybe it's like sending out some other notification. So there's lots of different opportunities here. And so that's why this was an important topic for me, because it does bring these two worlds together and unlock some new capabilities. So let's talk a little bit more about the problem. And this is without using the proactive messaging feature. So here we've got Power Virtual Agents, like you can think of this as our client, and then we've got Power Automate, you can kind of think of this as our server. Now what's going to happen is our client is going to issue essentially an HTTP request. The PVA connector itself, the trigger is actually under the hood, using HTTP, and then the response action is also using HTTP as well, even though it's not called that out in the connector. But what ends up happening is you send a request over from Power Virtual Agents to Power Automate, you hit an HTTP trigger, then you might do some processing here. Perhaps this is where you call your RPA workloads, and then at 2 minutes, your PVA client will actually time out. And so you won't actually be able to receive a response. Like even after your RPA job completes, there's essentially a disconnected client, so you're not actually able to send any information back. And so this is kind of the core problem we have, especially with RPA, where you've got, just naturally more time required in order to complete a job. Like even sending a request to Power Automate Desktop, kind of your best case scenarios, you're looking at 30 to 45 seconds to get just a very simple response back, because you're logging onto a machine, you're logging off from a machine in unattended scenarios, and that just takes time. So the 2 minutes becomes a fairly significant constraint when you try to actually go ahead and make this all work. Now, what's the solution? How can we go ahead and deal with this? Now, what we'll do is we'll continue to use an HTTP request. We'll go ahead and call that Power Automate Cloud Flow. But then what we're going to do is we're going to send an acknowledgement right back before we do any additional processing, any additional logic. And so this will then prevent the client from timing out because it's received a response. And in general, we're talking about like a second or two for that response to come back. And we can essentially give a status message back to the Power Virtual Agent saying, yes, I've received your request. I'm going to go now start processing it. Then what you can do is you have your logic where you're doing all of your RPA, and then in parallel, what you can do is you can stage different update messages back to the user so that they have a sense of what's going on. So basically saying, yeah, I'm working on your request, send another message after a little delay saying, yep, still being processed. And then once it's done, being able to go ahead and say, yep, job complete. And then this way, from a user perspective, they're kept in the loop. They're not blocking. They can still go ahead and have other, conversations with the chatbot itself. They can talk to other topics as well. And it just lends itself to a good experience. And as I chatted about on the previous video, the way that this works, like this will only work with Teams as of right now because we've got persistent chat. What we're doing is we're piggybacking on top of a previous session to be able to go ahead and put a message back. And because of Teams, you can close your Teams client, open your Teams client back up, see all of your messages that you've exchanged previously. It's that mechanism that actually makes this all work. So let's go ahead, let's get into a demo. I'm going to demo essentially what I just chatted about before, where we're going to send a response back, and then we can have some parallel activities where we're doing some processing and can show this in action. Now let's start with our Power Automate desktop solution. So this is very simple, but it's going to represent a long-running RPA process. All we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and display a message, but we're going to have a timeout. So after 150 seconds or 2.5 messages, that display message box is going to disappear automatically, and we're going to return context back to our Cloudflow. Okay, so let's take a look at Power Virtual Agents, and then we'll take a look at the Cloudflow. So very simple topic that we've got here, just calling it long-running RPA. Trigger phrases, just a couple phrases just to kick this off. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and provide a message. Let's kick off your RPA process. We're then going to go ahead and call our Power Automate Cloudflow and get the response back from the Cloudflow, and then just go ahead and place the message into the chat itself. Now, once again, this has to be hosted in Teams, so I will be switching over to Teams here in a little bit. Now, any other messages that happen after this one, after our initial response, are going to come directly from Power Automate. And so that's something that's quite different here, is that we won't be sending messages through this topic. We will be sending messages from Power Automate into our general chat with the user itself. Now let's go ahead and take a look at this specific Cloudflow. So we don't have any inputs. We don't need any for now. Here's that response I just talked about. So indicating your RPA process request has been received and will now be processed. Then I've got some parallel action here where I can go ahead and call that Power Automate desktop flow that I talked about before and showed you. And then what we'll go ahead and do is we're going to delay for just 30 seconds, just to show some just what this could look like in the real world, where you want to be able to provide some updates to the user so they don't think that something has failed and they just don't know about it. So we'll go ahead, we'll delay 30 seconds because we've talked about having a 2.5 minute desktop flow execution. Then we're going to go ahead and just send a message to this specific user using the post message in a chat or channel action as part of the Teams connector. And this is why we need to use Microsoft Teams. And then here, this is where we're going to use post as, and we'll post as the Power Virtual Agent as opposed to the flow bot or a user. We'll post it in the chat with bot, so an existing chat. And then this is the chat bot itself that I have published as a channel to Microsoft Teams. And then here we're just going to provide a message saying your RPA process is running, stay tuned. And I've just dropped timestamps in here so you can see that. I don't expect you to wait 2.5 minutes watching paint dry to see this demo complete. So I'll edit out a lot of that part, but you can at least see when the timestamp, when they were actually received. So here we'll wait another 60 seconds, send another message. And then once both of these different swim lanes complete, then we'll be able to go ahead and send our final message saying your RPA process is now complete and was successful. Once again, we have the timestamp here to designate when it completed itself. So let's flip over to Teams and let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so I'm in Teams. I'm having my chat with the Contoso customer service chatbot, and here I'm just going to go ahead and type RPA. And so at this point, we're going to kick off that topic. And so this was the message that was part of our topic, right? Let's kick off your process. And then this was the message that was sent back from the Cloudflow, just indicating that your request has been received. So I'm going to pause the video here, and then we'll let these next updates come streaming in. Okay, so we had that 30-second delay, and then we get the first update from the Power Virtual Agent, essentially the proactive message from Power Automate rather. And so now we'll pause it again and wait for the next two updates. Okay, there's the next update. And then finally our last message indicating that our RPA process has now been completed successfully. So naturally you can pass, outputs from your RPA process back to your chatbot. Perhaps you have like transaction numbers, work orders, things of that nature. You can go ahead and include those identifiers in the chatbot itself. All right, so that concludes the demo, but pretty powerful stuff, right? And I really find that a person's creativity is going to really yield some interesting results with this specific feature, because with RPA, you can naturally have like a user interface in some ways where you can go ahead and have a command center and control all of your RPA automations that need to be kicked off manually. You can now do that from Power Virtual Agents, get the feedback signals back into your chat, being able to do that from a single place. So you could build menus and adaptive cards around all of this that could kick off different chatbots that you want to, or different RPA bots that you want to initiate, and manage it through a single surface, which I think is pretty darn cool. So thanks for checking out this video. If you're not following me on Twitter, go ahead and find me at Weare. On the YouTube channel, likes, subscribes, comments, always welcome. Thanks again for checking out this video, and we'll see you again next week. Take care.